Imagine that each morning when you wake up, you're smiling and looking forward to your day, knowing that you're happy even while dealing with grief and loss. The Grief and Happiness podcast inspires, comforts, and supports you with each new episode. For more support, check out the Grief and Happiness Handbook and cards. I welcome you to listen to this podcast and discover endless possibilities for your life. Aloha. I have a very special guest for you today who's an author, and she writes really fascinating stuff that I think you'll be very interested in. So, hi, Marion. This is Marion Agnew. Could you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Marion Agnew. I'm a writer. I live in just a little north of Thunder Bay, Ontario, Canada, but I grew up in Oklahoma and lived in the States for the first half or so of my life. So I'm a dual citizen, and that's given me a really fun perspective.
That is interesting. I hadn't really thought about that before. Lately, I have so many friends in Canada. My publisher is in Canada. And so I've met a lot of people up there, and it's kind of fascinating, the connection between the U.S. and Canada.
Absolutely. The similarities and differences are one of the things that Canadians love to talk about. Americans, I don't think so much about Canadians, but Canadians spend a lot of time thinking about Americans because we have to. There's so many of you, of me, of us. So yeah. I see both sides.
That's really interesting. I've been reading your novel, which it's fun. It's a fun novel. And it's made me think about, I imagine other people may be thinking about the lines that are in your novel with their loved ones who have transitioned and are still hanging around. So I think I'd love for you to tell us about the inspiration for your novel and how that came to be. And
Great, I'd love to. Yeah, my novel is called Making Up the Gods, and it's published by a small publisher from Sudbury, Ontario, latitude 46. And it's a contemporary novel, so it's set today. And it's about a widow who is estranged from her family, the living family, that is, and about what happens when a stranger shows up at her door and claims to be her cousin at just about the same time that she's agreed to keep a 9-year-old boy for a long weekend, in spite of not knowing anything about kids. And the inspiration, of course, is both my life and not my life. I have been a writer. I was a technical writer for a long time, and I was fortunate enough to begin writing what I call my own writing or my work or creative writing, fiction and nonfiction, but about things that are important to me. About 2004, 2005 was when I was starting. And so this is the first novel that I finished all the way. I had written several other partial novels, 3 or 4 of them, and I didn't like how they were going. And so I abandoned them. But this one just wouldn't let me go. So I kept going with it. And so a novel has so many moving parts. It's like an entire full course meal at a restaurant instead of an appetizer or an entree. So I wanted to make parts of it that were similar to my own experience so that, for example, when I look out the window, I see Lake Superior. And my main character, Simone, the widow, also looks out the window and sees Lake Superior. I love where I live, so does Simone. And so because there were other moving pieces, like I'm not a 9-year-old boy, and I'm actually not a 69-year-old widow either, but I'm closer to that than I am to the other 2 characters. I wanted to have some of it be grounded in my own experience. I had actually met Simone. That sounds a little woo-woo, but I had written about her in a short story when I very first started writing my own writing. And she was just 1 year past the death of her husband. And she was trying to decide, would she stay in Ontario, this place that she loved, but she had lived there only with William. She had been there as a child and then come back to live later and met her husband. And so did she want to stay or did she want to go? And in the short story, she decides to stay. But I always would come back to her. And as I was writing other essays or short fiction, I think, I wonder what Simone's doing. I wonder how she is. And one day I thought, well, I think I'm ready to start a novel. So I will start with Simone. And the very first scene that I saw was Simone standing up to her ankles in Lake Superior with a 9-year-old boy. And they were talking about Indigenous traditions. And he asks the question, or he says, at one point, if I got to be the one making up the gods, I'd make up only happy gods, only gods that did good things, not ones that are bad. And the book just kind of took off from there.
That is so cool. I I always encourage people to write to help them deal with their grief because I'm a writer too, an author of books, but I write all the time, whether it's in my journal or plans for things that I want to do. And I love how you said that you had started other books and you were able to put them aside when they weren't working for you. Because I think so many times when, especially fledgling writers, they know they've got a novel in there and they just feel that they have to complete it, whether it's working or not. And it's a great lesson to learn that you can let it go. you
You can, yes. And this didn't, I mean, I finished this several times. I've announced I'm finished, and then I'd look at it again and it needed more work. So, but there's a little bit of grief that comes with that, letting go of things that I had spent a lot of time thinking about in the past. And there's a little bit of guilt too, it's all so interesting how it's related to losing a loved one. I mean, it's the same as thinking these people aren't gone. They're just, those aren't my stories to tell. Like I'm not compelled to finish them. Whereas the story of Simone really, it really wouldn't let go of me. And I got to where I felt so guilty, and I actually finished a pretty good draft of it during the pandemic lockdowns. And I thought, well, I don't know, maybe I don't need to publish it. The middle to later middle-aged woman is not exactly underrepresented in the publishing world. This is a fun story and I love it a lot, but I don't know, maybe it doesn't need to go out into the world in a big way. And so then I thought, I owe it to them to at least see if there's a publisher who's interested in it. And Latitude 46 found it to be a story about Northern Ontario that she thought, that publisher thought would appeal to a lot of people. And that was my biggest hope, is that people would see themselves in Simone and start thinking about the stories in their own lives that maybe they're telling themselves that aren't working as well as they used to.
Wow, that's so cool. I know that with writing, you do feel like you've got a relationship with the people. And I think the best writing comes from that because you know them. And if you don't know them, then they seem very artificial. And you can tell that in people's writing. So that's really interesting. And I love that you have written both a novel and do other kinds of writing too, because it gives you a balance. And if you're like I am, I write a lot of things and nobody ever sees them. They might lead, like your Simone might lead eventually to something really special.
I do write, as you do. I think it's my way of working things out. And I don't know what I would do. I enjoy drawing. I enjoy pretty colors. I've knit and crocheted. My mom used to do those kinds of needle arts. My sister's an excellent artist. She's focusing on colored pencil drawing right now, but she's always up for a fun art project when she comes up here to visit. And I love those things, but I'm not working out anything in those. Those are just play. And yet, when I sit down with one of my notebooks that I've resolved to write in all the pretty notebooks that I've been given, when I sit down with a notebook and a pen or at my computer, trying to figure out, why does this bother me so much? How can I let go of that? or maybe I saw something on my walk today and it's a beautiful image and I want to remember it. I write that down, and who knows if it will go anywhere. But I need to spend that time with myself in a way.
I think that's very important. And I love what you said about remembering something by writing it out and describing it. Is I know I have moments when I go, I know that I had something that I really wanted to write about here, and it's gone because I didn't write myself a note to start off with. And you can also get a lot of joy, like that pretty flower that you saw, and get a lot of joy out of describing it and feeling it. And it gives you a whole different perspective on the flower. And that can make you smile, and things that make you smile and feel good. I draw, I learned how to draw relatively recently after both of my husbands died. I always had myself convinced that I couldn't draw. And I took one class at the art center here and discovered that I could. And I love it. It's such a wonderful form of expression, and nobody has to see my drawings.
Yeah.
I can put whatever I want to on them and really enjoy it. And don't worry about judgment. Don't care about whether anybody else will like to see it or not. But it feels really good, the process of doing it.
It really does. It's a way of looking deeply at something, of giving it attention is a form of noticing. It's almost a spiritual act. And it's one of the ways, I mean, as someone who is a writer, I'm sure you also may have this tendency. I can sometimes get in my head a lot and start to narrate what's going on. And, well, what if that happened? And what if the other thing was different? And if I sit down to draw something, then I have to stop that, because there's this picture that I'm creating from a thing in front of me. And I can't do that if I'm telling a story about what happened at the coffee shop this morning. I have to be here now, as it goes, to pay attention to this flower or whatever it is.
Yeah, it's a form of meditation to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you wrote now the name is slipped, Meditations
On Alzheimer's, yes.
on Alzheimer's. There you go.
Yes. Yes, my first book was a collection of essays. My mother developed dementia when I was relatively young. I was in my 30s. She was in her late 70s. She was 43 when I was born, so we've always had a little bit of an age gap between us. But so when I was in my 30s, I felt that, I had a little of the special snowflake energy, because my mother was developing dementia, and it was the 90s. And so nobody, there was no such thing as, oh, go online and learn about it. Dr. WebMD or whatever, Dr. Google wasn't even a thing, which has its pros and cons. But I really felt alone. I would try to go to an Alzheimer's meeting, and everybody there was ancient. They were 50. And some of them actually were in their 60s, and their moms were, mid 80s or close to 90 and still alive. And I was like, this is so unfair. And so I wrote a lot during that time. Like, what does dementia look like? When they say that she will lose words, what does that mean? How I wrote because I wanted to describe it, to kind of keep it and contain it a little bit, but also so that I couldn't lie to myself about what I was seeing. Like, I didn't live with my parents, and my dad was taking care of my mom. And so I would go to visit her, and she wouldn't be the confident woman that I had known. She didn't seem to know how to cook. My father was doing laundry. He never did laundry. And it's not that that's a bad thing, but mom had ways of doing things, and he was kind of not adept at these things. And so when I left, if I didn't write down those things and make myself face them, I could easily just kind of tell myself a story that, oh, it's not so bad. I'm sure they'll be fine. And that would have dishonored both of them. And we did that enough anyway. She was so intelligent and over-identified perhaps with her own intelligence. She was a mathematician and mathematics professor. And so when she would forget words or not be able to remember things or start to say something and not be able to finish her thought, we were like, it was difficult for us to allow her to be not the confident, dominating presence that she'd always been in our lives. So we would, oh, poo poo, that's fine, not a big deal. So the writing in that time, and then later when I began to revise, it was a way of that same sort of paying attention, that noticing, and also the process of containing the story on this piece of paper here in black and white, if you printed it. And that took some of the immediacy of the pain away from it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, I know often people feel so alone at a time like that. And I had an experience with my mom in that she lived about an hour away. And I knew that after Dad died that she really didn't like living by herself, but she wasn't willing to do anything else because she wanted to stay in that house. And you could have normal conversations with her and everything was just fine. But we started gradually seeing that something wasn't just fine. Like I would call her from being an hour away on the phone to check up on her. And she would, I have a sister who's 9 years older than I am. And she would talk to me like about current things that were absolutely normal. And then she'd say, but the one thing that's really bothering her is when you girls run around the house and hide behind the chairs and you jump out and you scare me. And I thought, whoa, but then she'd slip right back into complete normalcy. And we found out later that she had a brain tumor that was causing these kind of, so it wasn't your typical dementia that you see in people where everything kind of goes. It was like things would kind of go in and out depending on what was happening in her brain. So I think it's really important to notice and pay attention to things like that and find someone to talk to, like your age in dealing with your mom. That was in those days, it was really hard to find that sort of thing. Now you can go on Google and say, hey, I'm looking for a support group for people in their 30s whose parents are dealing with dementia, and you'll find something. So it's really neat. I know I started a writing group after I'd had two husbands die, and after the second one died, and I was living here on Maui and didn't know that many people because we came over for him to be here because he used to live here and loved it, and that's where he wanted to be. But then it was like, okay, now what do I do? But I wrote a lot and the writing was helping me. So I decided I wanted to start a writing group where we could write about what we were dealing with in our grief and then talk about what we wrote. And I loved the idea, but I didn't know how to get the people. And I had heard of Meetup before online, and I thought, I'll just try this. So I put a notice on Meetup that what I intended to do and invited people to come to my house on a certain Saturday afternoon, and they showed up. And I had a whole new group of friends who all could relate to what I was dealing with at the same time. And it was just wonderful. So I think people there are people in all the different categories. Often we feel we're the only one that's experiencing this. But you can find somebody else, and it makes all the difference in the world to be able to have somebody to relate to.
It really does, especially, and I think writing is such a wonderful tool for that. I was fortunate when my mother was ill. I was working at a publishing company in Colorado, and one of my coworkers is a poet, and she also volunteered for a hospice organization. And I was fortunate to then know from her that hospice has depending on, of course, the organization. But hospice groups often have grief support groups. And another friend, as my mother was getting worse, her father had passed away, and she said, I wouldn't go to therapy, but I highly recommend those grief support groups because you do, it is something. I mean, I think I wrote about this in one of my essays that grief it's this opposite, this land where you are both separate from everybody else because you're grieving the loss of your mother or your husband or, God forbid, a child. And yet you're united with everybody else. Everybody, their mom eventually dies, whether you love it or not. And there's more people who are going through things like that than you know. We don't really typically talk about it all the time. And I don't know, it was my mom's sickness and death was the first really big thing I'd experienced. I couldn't turn to peers, but I did have this poet friend who led a writing group through hospice. And so I think it was 6 weeks, and we'd meet and she'd give us an assignment between times, and we'd come back and share our assignment. And one of them, I was thinking about this when I was listening to an interview you were doing with another writer. One of them was to write down what happened, write down the death of your loved one, write it down, write how it felt. We're using sensory details, just write that story. And because otherwise it's sort of like flashes and you can't let go of it because it's not written out. And so that was among the best advice I got. And when my father died 7 years later, I did write about what that experience was like, because then you don't have to give well, on Wednesday we did this, and then by Friday he was that. You can just give the succinct version that people have the tolerance to hear, but without someplace, either on the page or with a group of people, or both maybe, to share everything. I think that's one of the most lonely feelings of all.
It really is. People often are puzzled about what to do for a bereavement gift because although flowers are beautiful, they don't last that long. And my most recent book, the Grief and Happiness Handbook, I love to give, and my Grief and Happiness cards are also a really good thing to have. But something else that anybody can get any place is a pretty notebook. You were talking about all the beautiful notebooks that people have given you, and you're actually writing in them. And I think doing that was sticking a nice card in it. So it's not, you didn't write on the book, but you write on something while you're giving it to them and encourage them to tell their story, because that's it helps you so much. The more you tell it, the less you have to say. And when you get it written out, then you find that you have room for other things. You're not constantly trying to hold on to the experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not playing over and over on a loop in your head somehow. Yeah, that's a really great gift. I hadn't really thought about that.
Yeah.
Much as I love to receive a notebook, I hadn't thought about handing them to people who could use one.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a really good idea. But then everything's about writing for me. So
well, that's true. That's true. And I will say that I love to read books, and I don't necessarily object to reading books about writers, but I didn't want to write a book about a writer. So when I was writing my novel, I was trying to think of something for a profession that Simone could do that wasn't writing. And because I kept feeling that if she had had a grief support group and a notebook and a pen, she might not have ever needed that story to be told. And so I wanted to make sure she didn't have exactly what she needed to work through the loss of her husband, which in turn made her think of her mother. You know, those old tapes that play in your head, the not good ones, and that led her to feel kind of stuck a little bit.
yeah. I love the idea of writing, all the different kinds of writing that you can do to help you work through your grief. I think it's the best way out there to deal with it. It's you're your own personal therapist to
Hmm.
be able to do that. And I'm not saying don't talk to somebody else or don't go to groups, but it's something that you can do anytime. I do it first thing in the morning because it puts everything in perspective for the day. Other people I know have to write at night before they go to bed. So do it wherever and whenever you want to do it, but write, tell your story, whatever it is.
Hmm. I agree. I think too, one of the things that I've noticed, I'm still involved in the dementia community because it's so people are so afraid of people who have dementia, and it's stigmatized a lot. And even in my novel, Simone's a little afraid that she's developing dementia and feels a little isolated. And so she wants community for that reason. But so I'm still involved with the dementia community. And I've noticed that people who are care partners to someone with dementia have this urge to share what they've learned, because every person with dementia is a different person. They're all unique individuals. And so maybe what you think is going to work doesn't work as their cognitive changes come. Like your mom's, they might come and go. It might be a quick decline. It might be very slow. I know a man who was diagnosed with dementia 20 years ago, and he's still alive and kicking and comes to meetings. And he says, don't talk to me about my calendar, but I'm here and I'm having a great time. So you don't know. And so every person has this experience and this wisdom and understanding. And it's, I think, one of the most lovely things about human nature is wanting to share that with someone else so that they don't maybe have to feel as bewildered as you did, or perhaps what is working for them has quit working and they want to know, is it something I'm doing wrong? My loved one is now angry all the time, and what am I doing wrong now? And to find a way to share their knowledge and information that may just be part of what your loved one is going through. I think that generosity of spirit is really amazing. And there is a clearinghouse online called All's Authors, and they're a not-for-profit organization, and they have lists and lists of books. My first book is listed there, and also podcasts now and blogs, and from all people, from children, or as my father used to call us, offspring, because we were no longer children. But if you have someone who is a relative of some kind or just a friend, there's all kinds of resources there. And there was nothing like that available 20 years before when I was going through that, and really could have used just a quick Google search to find a blog to read, at 3 a.m. when you don't want to be bothering your friends. But I'm always struck by the generosity of people who have been care partners or who even have had an experience like going through a cancer diagnosis and receiving treatment and coming out the other end with a new kind of healing. They want to help other people going through that. I think that's a really wonderful thing about human nature.
It is. We Ram Dass lived here on Maui, and one of his last things that people remember him for was the phrase, "We're all just walking each other home."
Exactly. Right.
Well, it's been wonderful talking to you today, and we're going to include in the show notes how you can find the information that Marion was talking about here, and I include that
All's authors.
All's authors.
Yes.
I hadn't heard of that before, and I think that's a great resource. So, and I'm all about having resources for people. So, thank you so much for being my guest today.
Well, thank you so much for asking. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, we'll see my listeners next week, and I hope you enjoy this and tell your friends about it so that they can enjoy it too. Aloha. Do you want more comfort and support and happiness? Join the Grief and Happiness Alliance at our free gatherings on Zoom every Sunday. Visit my website at griefandhappiness.com and read my books, The Grief and Happiness Handbook, and get your set of the beautiful Grief and Happiness cards. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast, rate it, review it, and binge listen to all of our episodes. I can't wait to welcome you back to another episode of the Grief and Happiness Podcast.